Coming up on Bruce Lee Lives. He threw down in his movies.
You wanted to be able to do that.
And battled on the streets of Hong Kong.
Growing up in a rough area where he had to defend himself.
He fought Chinese traditionalists.
He defied the Chinese martial arts community.
Injuries.
You gotta overcome injuries.
And the Hollywood system.
I even think of him as like a hustler.
Bruce Lee's spirit is alive today as others fight for their goals.
This is a guy, he went out and did it. There were no limits.
And overcome obstacles.
Everybody has an obstacle they have to overcome.
It's Bruce Lee, the fighter, on Bruce Lee Lives.
Ryan, when you hear the name Bruce Lee, like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
When I hear the name Bruce Lee, the first thing that comes to my mind is the poster that hung on my wall when I was about 8 years old.
Dynamic hero, action fighter dude. Just an iconic figure.
Whenever he's on screen, you kind of can't take your eyes off him.
Someone that made martial art more than what it was.
Mayhem Miller. Well, when you first say the name Bruce Lee, it conjures up a million images of fancy kicks and the classic singing sounds. Whoa! Man, Bruce Lee has had an impact on every martial artist or every moviegoer for the past 30 years.
Bruce Lee. He single-handedly changed movies and martial arts forever and remains an enduring icon today.
You'd have to find someone almost brain dead who doesn't know who he is.
Now, Bruce Lee lives in the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time. On this episode, we take on Bruce Lee, the fighter.
You wanna fight? I'll take you on.
Throughout his life, Bruce Lee faced many foes, from individuals to cultural conventions to racism and the Hollywood system. And today, his spirit inspires others to fight their own battles.
From where I came from the streets, being around gangs, being around bad things that I shouldn't have been at a young age. And where I grew up to now is being an inspiration.
To many, Bruce Lee the fighter is the man from his movies.
Bruce Lee was one badass.
There's something about being one guy and being able to just kick the crap out of like 30 people.
You wanted to be able to do that. You wanted to be able to fight and like feel no pain.
Even if he's not talking, it's just the intensity in his eyes. There was electricity flowing through that man.
In his films, he never backed down from a fight, whether facing street gangs, karate champions, or even NBA superstars.
He's somebody that was 135 pounds and could beat anybody up.
Here's a guy, little guy, who's beating guys that are like 10 times the size.
Tiny little guy. But those are the ones to watch because they pack the most punch. Because you never see them coming.
But Bruce Lee wasn't just a fighter on screen. He was a fighter in life. And his lessons apply universally. Whether you're in a cage,
to fight is to compete. We're all born to fight.
Or any other field.
Skateboarding was so freestyle. It's like fighting. It's about competing with other people.
In motocross, it's a battle. You against another guy on a level playing field.
Stand-up comedy is a battle. Every time I do a show, I go in it like it's a fight.
Bruce Lee's actual fighting began on the streets of Hong Kong. While growing up, he found himself in numerous street fights.
Growing up in a rough area where he had to defend himself. I believe that was the impetus for his beginnings in martial arts.
Fearing for his safety, Lee's parents enrolled him in martial arts classes at the age of 13, where under legendary Wing Chun Sifu Yip Man, Bruce Lee studied Kung Fu, taking to the style like a natural. But Lee was always a street fighter at his core, a trait that would in part define his life.
He was the one who really said, you know what, one martial art style is not going to cover you in street fighting.
Survival is different. You don't know the caliber of your opponent. And then you have implements, beer bottle, knife, club, that changes the routine.
So you have to be prepared for anything and everything that combat brings.
To Lee, overcoming any opponent or any obstacle called for many tools in your toolbox.
Okay. There are various kinds of strikes. It depends on where you hit and what weapon you will be using. There is the finger jab, there is the punch, there is the back fist, and then low. Of course, then they use leg, straight at the groin, or come up.
And winning always came to the most prepared.
I fear not the man.
I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once.
10,000 kicks once.
But I fear the man.
But I fear the man.
Just practice one kick.
One kick.
One kick.
One kick 10,000 times.
Bruce Lee felt that practice truly did make perfect. A concept shared by many top artists and competitors today.
Doing something so many times, repeating it, puts it in your mind to where it comes second nature.
So that it becomes a reflex rather than having to think about doing something.
And your body reacts by itself. So you don't even gotta think. Your body just reacts.
You want to be better than Stevie Ray Vaughan? You gotta practice your ass. You want to be better than Bruce Lee? You gotta practice your ass.
While Bruce Lee's theories on fighting can be applied universally, nowhere are they more evident than in the world of mixed martial arts.
I would actually say Bruce Lee's the creator of mixed martial arts, without a doubt.
Bruce Lee was like one of those starting points for all of us. For us to ignore his contributions would just be silly.
Kenny Florian, a top-ranked UFC fighter, is a huge Bruce Lee fan.
Check, check, check. I don't know how many mixed martial arts fighters are as influenced as Bruce Lee as I am. I grew up watching his movies.
When Florian prepares for a fight, Bruce Lee is as much a coach as an inspiration.
Bruce Lee was really a visionary in that he knew that fighting, true fighting, is fluid. It changes in an instant, and you need to have moves that will work in an instant. A fight should always be based on muscle memory. You know, Bruce Lee used to talk about that.
Oh, jump it, jump it, jump it!
He knew way back then that you need to be extremely fast, you need to be extremely strong. I have a strength conditioning coach that I work with so I can be the best possible fighter, because a Ferrari with no gas doesn't go anywhere. I've been training for months. You know, I feel like I'm ready.
Bruce Lee didn't just fight with his feet and fists. He was someone who set goals and fought to get what he wanted.
Bruce was the type of an individual that if he told you he was going to do something, he did it.
A recurring opponent was the status quo. After moving to the U.S., Lee began teaching Junfan Kung Fu, meaning Bruce Lee's Kung Fu. He taught all races and creeds, defying traditionalists who staunchly believed it shouldn't be taught to non-Chinese.
Of course, he was teaching people outside the Chinese community. My gosh, I mean, he was mixing it up with whites and blacks and Hispanics and other Asian groups, God forbid.
He defied the Chinese martial arts community. This was so against tradition, so against thousands of years.
Lee would go on to challenge traditional martial artists again, as he blended numerous styles together and rejected any element he considered useless.
I don't believe in system, Mr. Longstreet, nor in method.
That's going to throw some salt in some of these grandmasters' games. This is going to make a lot of people mad about what this young Asian guy's doing.
The wonderful thing about my godfather is he wasn't afraid to go against the grain.
It pissed a lot of people off by that. A lot of people hate things that go against the average thinking, because one thing that we do as humans, we try to group everything together.
Lee's revolutionary spirit inspires many top athletes and entertainers today.
I see a very similar parallel between his opposition or going against the tide, going against the grain of culture of the martial arts scene, because we, as a skateboard culture, we had to go against the tide of what people said we were, and went from backyard swimming pools to stadiums. And it all started with us having a dream and not allowing anything to get in the way of that.
Bruce Lee was challenged many times to fights because people didn't like the fact that this little guy was going against tradition. And like myself, it's probably why a lot of magicians that are not professionals hate me, because of my success and because I threw the tuxedo and the rabbit coming out of the hat and threw it in the garbage. But I think if you're true to yourself, you're passionate about what you want out of life, you just do your thing and never look over your shoulder. And Bruce Lee did that.
While Bruce Lee always fought for his beliefs, the path wasn't painless.
A lot of people were going against Bruce Lee. The industry.
Nobody wants to invest money in a relatively new Chinese actor.
Its own people, people with money.
But to Bruce, it wasn't about the obstacle. It was about how you dealt with it.
Well, we fight alone or all together.
The hell with circumstances.
To hell with circumstances.
I create opportunities.
Through his life, Bruce Lee faced numerous hurdles, but always looked adversity in the eyes and stared it down.
His whole thing was problem solving. It says life is problem solving.
Bruce Lee saw an obstacle and he's like, okay, I'm gonna get around this thing.
In 1970, while weightlifting, Bruce Lee severely injured his back. He was bedridden for months. The doctors said he'd never practice martial arts again. He used the time to write his seminal book, a philosophical treatise on fighting called The Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
If your back is crushed and you have to be hospitalized or immobilized from the back injury, many people would just be depressed and go, life sucks. Or some people write the Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
It's a mindset. He willed himself to come back strong. And not only just beat expectation, but just exceed it by miles.
I think the one thing you take is that this is all mental. There's such a mental aspect to all the martial arts and even living life.
Few action sports stars are bigger fans of Bruce Lee than Metal Militia rider Ronnie Feist.
He just had a really impact. I honestly thought I was Bruce Lee at one point. Like, I really wanted to be Bruce Lee really bad as a kid. So I would literally dress like him and eat my food with chopsticks. And my dad's just like, this kid's lost his mind, dude. I mean, I ended up getting a tattoo of him just out of, like, respect, you know? I don't know, I love Bruce.
Like Bruce Lee, Ronnie has faced serious injuries that should have ended his career, including his most recent.
All right, so 2 weeks left on the Nuclear Cowboy Tour, I crashed in Ontario. I caught the wall with my left femur, broke my femur. Got surgery the next night, got a rod put in, 2 screws. Bruce has been through major injuries that set him back, and this femur fracture has definitely been a setback. That's how weak it is. Can't even lift it up. I'm pushing to be back in 3 months, and I think the same thing with Bruce. If he gets hurt, it's a love for the martial arts. He's an athlete. I think when you put your mind to something and you believe it, ain't nobody stopping me. I'm gonna ride X Games. So that's how I look at it.
That's what I think set Bruce apart. He had love and passion for what he did, and he had a desire to be the best that he can be. You know, throughout the career, I've had injuries, and you know, you're faced with injuries, and you always gotta overcome injury.
There's 6 weeks until Summer X Games, and Ronnie is finally back in the saddle for the first time in months.
I guess I just gotta start somewhere, right? I think I'm gonna be a lot better off at X Games than people are gonna expect. I think I might even surprise myself.
I would hope Bruce is watching down, looking over. I would hope that he would be like, you know, well done, you know?
Ronnie knows the will to fight through injury has its rewards, just like with Bruce Lee. When Bruce's back was injured, they said he may never walk again. And then he went on to make the greatest martial arts movies of all time. The Big Boss, Fists of Fury, Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, Game of Death. Bruce Lee was a man who was used to winning his battles. But in his fight to be a Hollywood star, he faced his fair share of hurdles. But even to someone as determined as Bruce Lee, the Hollywood system was a formidable foe.
You got to think of the racism that he faced back at that time, where at that time not too many people have seen an Asian guy on a TV show where he's like the star.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee.
Sure, in 1966, he won the right to play a television sidekick in The Green Hornet and got other small roles in films and TV. But Lee believed he had the chops to be a leading man and wasn't getting the offers.
I think about what my godfather went through back then because Hollywood kept telling him, you know what, we just don't think the world is ready to accept somebody who's an Oriental. I mean, he saw it left and right.
The last straw came when he helped develop the TV show Kung Fu, then watched as the network gave the leading role to a Caucasian, David Carradine.
Kung Fu, yeah. He had helped come up with the premise for it. And then all of a sudden, to have that project pulled away from you because of the way you look. Come on.
Because if you're an investor in that picture, he understood that. But then he felt frustrated at that time period.
But in true Bruce Lee fashion, he fought through every roadblock, one way or another.
My father and my mother always tell me the story is they said, what are you going to do, Bruce? And he goes, circumstances, hell, I make circumstances. And so thus he went on to Hong Kong and he got together his own team and his own group and he made his own projects.
That's why he went back to Hong Kong. I remember when he was going back, he said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do pictures and I'm going to direct and I'm going to learn how to cinematography. I'm going to learn how to even write a script. And I thought, my gosh, he's a martial artist. But I think he proved a lot of people wrong.
When his Hong Kong films broke box office records, Hollywood finally took notice. Bruce Lee fought to be a movie star, and he did it his way.
I also see him as one of the original fathers of independent filmmaking. I really do. Because, he knew that, hey, if I can't get the studios behind me in Hollywood, then I really have to make my own path here. And I love how he really took control of his destiny in his own life.
I even think of him as like a hustler, you know what I'm saying? Like, he had to pave his own way to break into mainstream culture. I remember he didn't want to be just like the sidekick, because he knew he was more than that.
This is a guy, he went out and did it. There were no limits. He was a true rebel and a successful one.
Seeing no limits is the true fighter's way, something UFC star Kenny Florian knows all too well. He just lost nearly 20 pounds to compete as a featherweight. And if he can win his fight against top 5 fighter Diego Nunes, he just might get a shot at the title.
It's been a lot of pain and suffering. It's very much in line with what Bruce Lee used to talk about, is pushing beyond your limits. And when you think you've done that, push even more.
It's fight night, and Kenny Florian just hopes he's got more Bruce Lee in him than his opponent. In 3 full rounds, Florian and Nunes battle furiously. A skilled elbow by Florian draws blood, helping Kenny earn victory by unanimous decision.
I felt great out there during the fight. I felt really good. I got stronger as the fight went on.
What do you think Bruce would say?
It would be get back to work. That's what I'm going to do. Bruce Lee, he went and wanted to achieve what he wanted to do and attacked it with vigor and passion. And that's the way that I've tried to approach my life. And I think everybody should approach your life that way.
Like Bruce Lee, Kenny was steadfast in achieving his goals and won't stop till he gets his title. And it's not just fighters who can use Lee for inspiration. Whether they're proving people wrong.
There's been a lot of things in my life that people say, oh, you can't do that, or there's no way you're gonna be able to pull this off. And it makes me want to do it that much more.
Or overcoming hardships.
I believe I have a similar path in where I've had adversity. I was on drugs for 10 years. I went to prison for 5. And through that adversity, I've come out learning something from it and really applying it to my life in such a way that I could really influence others.
That's the cool thing I think that my godfather was able to offer people from different sports, is just how to rethink the game, how to think outside the box, how to be an explorer.
Bruce Lee overcame a lot of obstacles. Everybody has an obstacle they have to overcome.
Bruce Lee epitomized what it was to be a fighter.
There's a Bruce Lee in you, there's a Bruce Lee in me. And what does that mean? That means that you're a warrior. You shouldn't put the tail between your legs and apologize for being a human being.
I say the name Bruce Lee, what does that mean to you?
Bruce Lee was hot.
Bruce Lee was wow! In his movies, he'd take on like 10 dudes and light everybody up with one punch.
The sound effects, the noises he made when he would strike.
He was somehow more animal than most people and more godlike than most people.
He immortalized confidence. You could see it in his eyes, you could see it in his body movements.
He just knew that he was a badass. And I mean, I'm a badass, but damn.
Bruce Lee, a master martial artist, an expert fighter, and one of the most badass people ever to step on screen.
But what's cool about Bruce Lee is that he took martial arts, did it his own way, and put it in film. That's punk rock.
Now, Bruce Lee lives in the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time.
We'll show him.
On this episode, we take on Bruce Lee, the entertainer. Lights, camera, kung fu. Enter the ultimate action star. Bruce Lee blasted onto American movie screens in the early 1970s. Today, he's one of the biggest film icons of all time.
He literally was my first hero.
He was a superhero in my mind.
Bruce Lee's screen presence was electrifying. With a unique blend of physical ability and personal charm, he broke the hero mold.
Jean-Claude Van Damme, Steven Seagal. But the fact that these guys became huge action stars, it's not because of Clint Eastwood, it's not because of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it's not because of Sylvester Stallone. It's because of Bruce Lee.
He's been gone for nearly 40 years, but on screen, the Bruce Lee legacy is as potent as ever. Watch any of his films, even for the very first time, and his genius is impossible to miss. He had all the makings of a consummate entertainer. The ability to grab the audience with his killer moves.
Bruce Lee is the guy that makes ass-kicking the requisite thing to be an action hero. Literal ass-kicking. I'm not talking about figurative ass-kicking. I mean literally kicking your ass.
The ripped physique.
He had a tremendous physique. You know, when he took his shirt off, he wasn't bound by big muscles, but he was ripped.
Ripped.
The cocky attitude.
His swagger, his look was all his own, and it was just extremely cool.
A signature style.
He had a particular flair for the flashy.
And some full-on movie star magnetism.
I shall accept punishment for the lives that I took.
There's no one who has the full package. There's no one with the star power, the charisma.
Like Elvis, or I guess in that day, Michael Jackson. There was a certain quality to him that separated him. He seemed like a rock star.
Lee reached the pinnacle of fame in the early 1970s. But his star quality can be traced back to the very beginning. As a child actor,
Bruce Lee was an actor since he was a kid.
He was like this big.
Bruce Lee was born on November 27th, 1940, in San Francisco, while his father, a famous Cantonese opera star, was touring professionally. Upon returning to Hong Kong with his parents, Lee's own acting career took flight.
His father was in show business, and he started doing some TV shows in Hong Kong.
Boys are silly messing with me.
Lee found his place in the limelight. appearing in short black and white films as a child.
That ought to teach you a lesson.
He actually earned the nickname Little Dragon. He would show up in shows when he was like 6 years old.
Only the beginning.
Even in his youth, Lee honed the sensibility that would make him a megastar.
If you grow up in the Chinese opera, which is a big show, really big show, you get the idea that people want to see something quite flamboyant.
Bruce Lee, at a young age knew that he was onto something.
He's one of those people that have that it that you can't really develop. Like either you're born with it and it manifests in you or it doesn't.
Are you ready? I sure am. Your attention. He wants your attention. You're about to see a show you've never seen before. And you may never see again.
By the time he was 18, Bruce Lee had appeared in 20 films in his native Hong Kong. But he longed for a larger stage.
And Bruce was so eager to absorb all knowledge of filmmaking, which was what he loved.
His quest for success would lead him to the University of Washington to study drama, and eventually on to Los Angeles, where he landed the role of Kato on the Green Hornet.
Test X2, take one, speed.
Even in his screen test, Lee worked the camera like a pro.
Now look directly into the camera, Bruce.
Well, in Chinese opera, the way the warrior walk will be something like this. Walking this way, straight, come out, bend, straight, and then walk out again.
That he played on Green Hornet, Kato, the main guy's sidekick.
Another challenge for the Green Hornet. His aide, Kato, and their rolling arsenal, the Black Beauty.
From there, he started to become a little bit better known. He started showing up in cameos in other TV shows.
Lee's character Kato would later make guest appearances on the TV series Batman. But the small screen couldn't hold a talent this big for long.
It's not until later that, he goes from being this guy who's an incredible fighter and, a kind of burgeoning actor to being Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee first impressed American audiences with his television roles in the mid-1960s. But his real star quality wasn't showcased until years later, in a string of popular movies from the early 1970s. Films that would eventually become the stuff of legend and change the shape of Kung Fu cinema forever.
I don't know of any movie now that holds up to a Bruce Lee film.
I just would watch him on repeat, always, relentlessly.
I could recite probably all his movies, and I haven't even seen him in a while now.
Do you remember what was the first movie you saw?
Fist of Fury.
I watched Fist of Fury recently.
Fist of Fury. It's like early Bruce. You know what I'm saying?
I was probably 12 years old, and my Taekwondo instructor at the time, he lent me a video cassette of The Big Boss.
Probably the most impactful Bruce Lee film for me as a youth was Enter the Dragon.
Enter the Dragon, obviously it's the most notable, most famous one.
And just him kicking ass and taking names,
My favorite is Game of Death. Game of Death is my all-time favorite.
We all know kicking Kareem Abdul in his face, even though you're about 3 feet shorter than him.
I can't imagine what that would have been like to see it in the cinema the first time with an auditorium full of people, and he does that and everybody gasps at the same time.
I wish they would replay that more on TV, because I need to set my TiVo.
Bruce Lee's films became a cultural phenomenon, and each one helped cement his icon status.
I mean, there was nobody like him.
He's the bad boy, he's breaking all the rules. He really brought this, street style, raw edge.
Bruce Lee stole every scene he appeared in because he had an edge above the typical action star. Formerly a drama major at the University of Washington, he was an actor with serious conviction.
Bruce, as an actor, was great.
He took his craft as being an actor very seriously.
And he was a perfectionist.
There's a lot of subtleties in his movies that he was trying to portray.
Just him walking from point A to point B, just the way he walks, you can tell. Don't mess with that dude.
And there would be moments of depth and where you could see what he was thinking, and that there was a soulful quality to the way he worked.
Lee worked hard to hone his acting skills, but the perfectionist in him demanded to learn even more. he wanted to master the entire filmmaking process.
The way he choreographs his fight scenes are just amazing.
Cinematic language that he used was really designed to make the action more enhanced.
It's not just the martial arts, it's the martial arts blended with the camera work. It's acknowledging that the camera work is just as important. You can shoot a great fight, and if you shoot it from the wrong angle, it's going to look terrible.
Lee cared very much about how things looked, so he decided to take control.
He liked the precision, the quality. You better have the cameras ready because he's going to do it the first time.
He understood cinema. He really did.
Bruce Lee would do it all. Transcending the role of actor, he went on to write, choreograph, direct, and produce for film. And his standards were high. From his first starring role to his later work behind the camera, he held tight to a guiding principle: keep it real. This was a major deviation from the kung fu films of the past.
Well, originally, when you had martial arts-based films in Hong Kong, they were very fantastic. You know, they usually involved these guys who were mythic warriors that could fly through the air and were incredible swordsmen.
What he really did with martial arts and with action films is he simplified it. There's no gadgets, no one's flying. Like, he made it as real as possible, and that was his philosophy for Kung Fu.
He wanted the movements to be crisp and have a realistic reaction to it. The only time you go flying through the air is if you got kicked good and hard.
He made it awesome and cool to just be organic, to be real.
The sense of realism that Lee brought to his films had to feel authentic, for this was a man who knew what it was to fight.
He took his licks. I mean, he got the light speed out of him sometimes, you know, by some of the things that he had to do. Hitting the ground, making it look like he took a punch.
He was literally beaten and bruised and battered by the end of some of these film shoots.
The reason Lee was able to make fighting look so real hinged on one key factor: pure skill.
I mean, anybody who's watched Bruce is impressed by his speed, for one thing, because he's probably one of the fastest guys you've ever seen.
He's fast and agile.
Quick hands, and quick feet.
He was known for speed and, you know, how hard he can hit from a short distance.
The power didn't come from his enormous muscles. It came from his speed and his constant sort of readiness.
The legitimate skill that Lee possessed was rare in movies. This wasn't an actor trained to do stunts. This was an extreme athlete, first and foremost.
He brought out that athletic ability that you didn't really see in other martial arts movies.
A lot of the actors now don't have a skill set, anything like that, you know.
I mean, this wasn't like Karate Kid, Ralph Macchio, you know? It's like he could really throw down.
You know, for him to be doing a kick to an opponent twice the size and reaching his head, you know, I mean, that's something that, hell, we don't even see today.
But what we do see today is the power that the true artist brings to performance in any sport. Like Lee's insistence on realism in his films, the quality that sets them apart from the rest. Today's athletes aspire to match skill, style, and showmanship to continue to push limits and stand out from the pack.
You can't be fake. You got to know, like, you have those skills.
I think it's very important for the viewing audience to believe what they see happening on the screen. Whether it's wheelies and stoppies and riding a bike backwards, it has to be real. If Bruce Lee rode a motorcycle, that's how he'd ride.
In skateboarding, we have that same principle. Either you're the real deal or you're just a poser.
I would love to be the Bruce Lee of skateboarding in the sense of when I skate, I'm trying to be as good as I can be.
And I feel like in our sport, yeah, we may get out there and, you know, talk a big game. and get out there and stir up the media, but hey, in the end, we're still laying down 360s, backflip, all the gnarliest tricks, we do it. You have to be real.
Artistry and athleticism, the real way. It's all a part of the enduring Bruce Lee legacy. Bruce Lee captured the essence of the action hero. Adept as both an actor and a martial artist, he mesmerized movie audiences around the world. But his star quality had another vital element: no-holds-barred showmanship.
Bruce Lee had a great sense of what people wanted to see, what was appealing to his fans.
He understood how to market himself and draw the people to him.
He mastered the showmanship and the presentation.
He understood that you had to go that extra bit to make it stand out from the pack.
He had something much greater than martial arts. He had an emotional connection.
And a certain kind of charisma that made you want to watch him beyond just his skills as a martial artist.
Bruce Lee knew how to play to an audience. Even before he became a star, he understood the power of putting on a good show. Back when he competed in martial arts competitions, he would often demonstrate signature moves, like 2-finger push-ups and the 1-inch punch.
The 1-inch punch.
The 1-inch punch, he will put somebody on his butt from 1 inch away, and it's very impressive.
And I've seen his 1-inch punch, and he flinches and knocks people back like 5 feet. I'm like, how's he do that?
People think that's a gimmick until they've seen it in real life or on film.
These special moves became calling cards that secured Lee's reputation as the real deal. And even though he pushed for authenticity on screen, he knew how to throw in a little razzle-dazzle.
He really did walk this very specific walk that nobody had ever seen.
He would also do the kind of thing where he had the cocky little smile, like the sort of like fooling you into complacency.
He was comical, but yet he was serious.
He's like completely in control of his chi. I love that.
The way he would move, his fingers were always like either like this, he'd flick his nose. If you cut him, he'd stop. When he tasted blood, he'd spit it out.
I mean, when he tastes his blood and the look he gives, like, oh, it's on now, sucker.
He had to throw in that flash, that flair. You know, he had to do some fancy jump kicks and jump high. He knew that in order to draw people in who didn't know the technicalities of martial arts or whatever movie making, he had to show something that they could relate to.
Lee used his trademark moves and mannerisms to get his fight on, creating some of the most unforgettable action scenes ever captured on film. Today's artists and athletes face a similar challenge: how to blend signature style and showmanship to achieve a wow factor that is all their own, and thereby promote the individual sports they so passionately pursue.
I think showmanship is definitely something to understand as far as getting something like snowboarding, you know, getting it out to the public. It's a necessary thing to progress the sport, make it bigger.
Defending gold medalist Jen Hudak here at Winter X Games 14.
I think showmanship is huge. It's what separates out the best athletes from one another. I mean, you have to get there physically with your skiing ability, and then it's personality from there. That'll take you to the next level. The personality behind whatever it is that you're doing is hugely important. Bruce Lee became an icon because of that.
We all do the same tricks. We all ride the same jumps. But there's a way I do that trick that separates me from the way another rider does it. It's just style. Bruce is all about style.
Bruce Lee had a lot of his own original moves. Well, I got some original moves that I created. One of the things I learned growing up was the value of marketing, the value of building a character. What separates me from another guy who can do backflips on dirt bikes or can ride fast at the track or, race, is a good racer? There's a lot of guys with a lot of talent. There's only a few guys that have the eye for entertaining people.
You're doing a show. It's a show. I mean, wake up. That's the reality of it. These people want to be entertained. And what Bruce Lee was really good at was he developed his own way.
And you see that in athletes today. There's certain athletes that have that, and they stand out, and they shine, and they're the ones that everybody's attracted to.
Every sport has its superstars. Those that stand out from the rest in terms of their skill, showmanship, and style. For nearly 40 years, one man has personified that unbeatable combination. There is only one master.
Bruce had it all, man.
He kicked a lot of butt in movies. Pretty simple.
He had signatures, and those signatures end up being definition. He was completely unique in that way.
It's Bruce Lee, the individual, on Bruce Lee Lives.
What was so unique about Bruce?
He was truly a revolutionary.
Someone who was so passionate and dedicated. He was so smart. He brought exactly who he was to the situation.
When I hear Bruce Lee, I think badass. He had a lot of wisdom, and he kicked a lot of butt in movies.
I think Bruce is one of a kind. I think he was way ahead of his time.
Really, when I think about Bruce, I think about a guy that was about finding truth and going to the next level in all areas.
He wasn't afraid to be unorthodox. He wasn't afraid to go against the grain.
Bruce Lee was a man. Just listening to him speak.
Well, Kung Fu, the best example would be a glass of water. So every Kung Fu man is trying to do that, to be soft like water and flexible and adapt itself to the opponent.
Watching him fight, watching the way he moves.
Of course, I'm a Bruce Lee fan. He paved the way for Asian actors. He's an icon.
Bruce Lee was the individual.
He was the only Asian that people knew. Asian Americans were very proud of him.
First time I saw Bruce Lee, it was like watching the atomic bomb.
Now, Bruce Lee Lives, in the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time. On this episode, we take on Bruce Lee, the individual.
I must find out the truth.
It's called Being Your Own Man. And for Bruce Lee, the idea of standing tall and not caring what others thought made him so special. Time and time again, he fought back against the normal way of doing things, constantly thinking outside the box.
With anything new, there's obviously going to be some haters, people that are obviously trying to bring you down from what you're doing.
He went against the grain and did whatever he wanted to do. He was a true rebel and a successful one.
Part of what Bruce rebelled against were traditional forms of fighting techniques. For centuries, Asian combat methods were divided up into distinct disciplines: karate, kung fu, Muay Thai, and Taekwondo. Bruce took from each of these styles and incorporated them into Jeet Kune Do.
Back in those times, everyone was real stuck on tradition. If you did karate, you only fought in a certain stance, certain way, and you do certain things. But Bruce looked at it not as a sport, but as like, if I'm fighting for my life.
His approach, allowing himself to be influenced by other masters and other disciplines, I think that was a very modern approach to martial arts.
He tried to say, look, there's merit in all these other sports and styles. He was one of the first people that recognized wrestling as a martial art. That was a revolutionary way of thinking.
He didn't really have anybody to model after. He was the first of his kind to combine all these different styles, and just the things that he came up with is just groundbreaking.
And here was a man that was able to really break boundaries because he knew that the individual has a right to express themselves.
For Bruce, the idea of expressing yourself in an honest manner and following your own path was key.
5 things: genuine, honest, true, sincere, and real. In every note, in every punch.
Bruce Lee felt that truly expressing oneself was the way to personal freedom, and he was interested in doing this in all aspects of his life. In early 60s America, when it was still a crime to be seen in certain places because of the color of your skin, Bruce Lee let his heart lead the way when he married outside his race. He wed Linda Emery in 1964.
I don't know most people know this, but in the 60s, there was still a ban on interracial marriage. So there weren't too many states that practiced, the freedom to marry whoever you wanted.
He did not see any limits in what he wanted to achieve, whether it was marrying an American girl as a Chinese immigrant here in the United States.
He was the first Asian guy that I knew that either dated or married a white person. I think my cousin Paul told me about it, that no, he's married to a white person. I thought, you can do that? Well, how wonderful. You know what I mean? America, you know what I mean? The land of the free. And of course, through my life, I've dated many white girls, so thank you, Bruce.
In the 60s, people weren't as tolerant toward other religions, other racial groups. Bruce Lee went beyond that.
The lack of fear of what others thought and his ability to believe in himself completely allowed Bruce to inspire others to stand strong and push past the walls other people have tried to put around them.
He had a ton of barriers to break down. Coming over those obstacles and setting goals and achieving them has been something that my whole career has been about. Some things take longer than others. Some things I'll break more bones doing and trying, and, it's just how bad do you want it? And I feel like that's what he possessed.
It was the things that Bruce had said that gave me confidence that this is my body, this is skateboarding, I'm gonna express myself, I'm gonna work as hard, and this little Asian guy is gonna achieve this much. Surely I can get somewhere with what I've been given.
He's saying, you need to go beyond what I'm talking about. You need to find for yourself what truly is the best technique. That's where his genius really lies.
But Bruce's influence doesn't just extend to sports and fighting. Performers of all kinds look to him because of the strength of his individuality. The dance group, the Jabberwockies, have exploded onto the scene. And for them, Bruce Lee is one of the reasons they thrive.
Bruce Lee was an icon, somebody who wasn't afraid to be different. He believed in what he did, and he believed what he did was powerful and was something that was going to impact the world, and it did.
For the Jabberwockies, their dancing is just like Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do. It's not one style, but many styles.
If you were to throw the beat on boom, boom, cat, you get boom, boom, cat. Or you get boom, boom, cat. It's just using your body in a different way. So really, our dancing is like fighting. We're just not throwing punches or kicks.
And know for a fact that he's influenced all of us. A lot of people kind of thought of it was weird. These guys dancing in white masks, why are they doing that? How come they're mixing so many different styles of hip-hop dance? Why are they fusing so much? That's how Bruce Lee was.
He's applying all the movement philosophies to martial arts, but everything he says applies to us as dancers too. Because what we do at the end of the day is just another form of movement.
Just as if training for a fight, the Jabberwockies put in the time working out and preparing for every performance. In becoming the top martial artist of all time and an icon to all, Bruce Lee needed more than just punches and kicks. What he had was a philosophy about fighting and life that allowed him to be both steadfast in his ideals and open to change.
Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. Put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or creep or drip or crash. Be water, my friend.
The philosophy of being like water, I took that back into bike riding. So the way I utilized it was keep your mind wide open and be able to diversify your riding skills in any different way. And that's why I got it tattooed on me right here. Be like water.
What Bruce Lee taught us was you cannot have restrictions. I think MMA is a physical display of Bruce Lee's philosophies and teachings.
Bruce's philosophies, man, he had a ton of things. The most famous one was the "be like water" quote. And it's really cool because it's true, like water is adaptable. It's the most adaptable thing out there. It's the most powerful force out there.
It's all about flow. It's all about yin and yang. It's all about taking something that's coming at you and kind of moving to the side and working with it.
He was definitely always looking out of the box, and myself as a martial artist and even my coaches, I try to find guys like that who are always gonna look out of the box and evolve.
Empty your mind.
Be formless, shapeless.
Like water.
Be water, my friend.
When we talked a lot, it was always about being a good human being or evolved human being. He encouraged people to research it. He wanted you to experiment. He wanted you to create.
Bruce was teaching us to look past the normal conventions of how things are done, to overcome our fear of the new and embrace change.
He was about evolution and about constantly growing.
For many, Bruce Lee's mantra of evolving has been heard, and its power is being used.
It is that idea of evolution, to bring something new to the table, and when you bring something new, you can even bring something even more new. This is my life now. Like I want to follow this path. You know, always evolving and changing, trying to do something different.
One unique part about action sports is the fact that it can evolve so quickly and progress so quickly.
Bruce Lee was always evolving, always changing, always switching up his style, right? When you think you saw the best, he came out with something that was better.
He saw qualities in all these different martial arts that he could apply, you know, and what worked for him. So I applied that in skateboarding. Like, there's so many different things you can skate. It's like, if you just have a real rigid outlook, you're limiting yourself. You're not allowing yourself to just grow and do everything you can.
And I always think of what hasn't been done. And that's what freestyle motocross is all about. That's what people like to see as evolution.
I think constantly improving and constantly evolving, that's freestyle. Freestyle motocross is progression. And it's driven by passion, it's driven by love, it's driven by competition.
In my sport, you know, it's essentially a freestyle sport. There's no rules to how you do a trick. It's entirely up to you.
Some of the best skiers that you see right now are skiers that can ski in every discipline, and it's really important to have fun and kind of always never be just stuck in your ways, you know, always be open to other possibilities and see what's out there.
When your mind is rigid, you're not going to be able to handle every circumstance that comes to you. But if your mind bends and bobs and weaves and rolls with the punches, just adapting to your scenario, man, I just feel like you're going to be more successful in life.
To flow, to be like water means you must adjust to all things, including the environment in which you compete.
With skiing, there's so many different realms you can take it to. I mean, there's half-pipe skiing, there's slopestyle, there's also powder skiing. And in each one of those separate ones, it can keep evolving and progressing. There's no telling where it can go.
Another sport that shares Bruce Lee's philosophies is called parkour. It's all about adapting to your surroundings. But it has also struggled for acceptance among older, more established sports.
Bruce Lee's ideas of absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own creation and constantly research. You could easily apply that to parkour. You have to be able to adapt yourself to the terrain around you, be it urban, be it rural, wherever.
Bruce Lee understood that adapting to your environment or to your opponent was key. Everyone is different, whether it be your fighting style, size, speed, or any other attributes.
Not everyone can fight like Bruce Lee. If Kareem Abdul-Jabbar tried to fight exactly like Bruce Lee, it's not going to work for him because he's way longer, way lankier. He needs to use his tools.
Size-wise, weight-wise, you have to adapt a system for you.
Bruce Lee said, you may be a little bit bigger, fatter, you may be a little bit taller, shorter. Bruce Lee was not a big man. But he can teach a student that was tall what worked for them.
For the direct descendants of Bruce Lee's fighting style, the mixed martial artists of today, evolving is the key to winning. Adapt or die is the one truth.
Mixed martial arts is a constant evolution. Every 3 fights, you have a guy who does some new techniques.
And if you don't evolve with it, then you get left behind.
We are always changing as individuals. Everyone's path is different. And that's one thing that Bruce Lee really got into early on. We should not just follow blindly what a master or an instructor or a sifu tells us to do. It's your own individual path.
Adapt what is useful.
Reject what is useless.
And add what is specifically your own.
Bruce Lee was constantly battling. Whether fighting on the streets of Hong Kong or inside the ring in America, his quickness and power had him winning nearly all of his fights. But his physical strength would be no match against one opponent: racism. Bruce Lee's own words lay it out.
Under the sky, under the heaven, there is but one family. It just so happens that people are different.
From an early age, Bruce Lee understood bigotry. His mother was both German and Chinese, which was a source of confrontation with schoolmates.
Bruce went to a universal school in Hong Kong where there was a lot of English, and they were all bigger than he was. So he'd been in a few scrapes because Bruce wasn't the type to back down or to keep his mouth shut either.
Took your shoe shine box to get you here for a square off. Now you know I mean business.
He was educated in things that were Western, and he was educated in things that were Eastern, and I think that's made him unique.
As he grew older, Bruce Lee the fighter realized that some battles would have to be won with his philosophy rather than a punch or a kick. After he moved to the States, and while married to Linda Emery, Bruce was teaching martial arts to all groups. Because of this, he saw racism from fellow Asians.
I'll see what you've done.
Back in the 60s, the response that he was getting initially from, the Kung Fu community, for instance, was like, how could you? It was considered taboo. And I love that he was able to really just break through those boundaries.
When he made the move to Hollywood, the Asian stereotype was again a barrier that he set to break.
It bothered him. Like he said, man, they're not going to make me put my hands in my sleeve and play the typical, with the pigtail, Chinese man. So he didn't want to portray anything that would give the Chinese a bad image.
Moving from bit parts in TV and movies, Bruce Lee soon became the international icon he always knew he would be. And he did it by staying true to his beliefs about people and race.
His whole philosophy at that time was, if you can get the people to appreciate something in the Chinese martial arts, then they can fully understand and appreciate other things in the Chinese culture.
It was the first time that we saw Asian leading men, and kind of changed the whole cultural look of Asians here in America.
Everyone respected Bruce Lee. So he was the ultimate role model for Asian boys like me that wanted to, do something exciting, something new, and be respected by everyone.
No matter what racial group, they seemed to admire him. I mean, every Hispanic I've ever met always seemed to like him. Every African American I've met seemed to accept him.
Bruce Lee transcends race, no question about it. I mean, you gotta love somebody like that.
His ability to become one of the first Asian American stars has a lot to do with the time period in which he came to prominence. The fact that it was a time where people were more open and accepting to other cultures and other races.
Bruce definitely broke down a lot of barriers for minorities. Fortunately for me, I've never had race play any type of weird role in my life negatively, and it's because of guys like Bruce who took care of it early on.
For one thing, he made being Asian very cool. You saw this guy and you were like, wow, I want to be him.
He had characters that he played that were disenfranchised, that felt like they were the outsider. Playing characters that were able to rise above that disenfranchisement, he became a hero.
Bruce Lee's ability to see people, not colors, resonates with the Jabberwocky's own goals.
Just because we're Asian doesn't mean we're not down with hip-hop. Hip-hop is colorblind, and I think that's what Bruce Lee viewed himself. He's just colorblind. He loves all different races, and he just loves.
When we wore the mask, people didn't probably really expect to see Asian guys behind the mask, especially how we dancing. You know what I'm saying? We fought to become where we're at right now.
The reason why we look up to Bruce Lee, because, this is in the 70s, when it's a lot more ignorant than I would assume that it is nowadays. He broke that barrier for Asian Americans.
With the spirit of Bruce Lee giving them inspiration,
let's be like water, my friends.
The Jabberwockies put it all in action when they take the stage.
Thank you, Bruce, man. inspired a bunch of garage kids to now being on stage. Thank you so much.
Just paying it forward. Bruce Lee started it, we just gotta keep it going. We're just a product of him.
Bruce Lee's power was beyond belief. But it was his strength and his beliefs that caused us to look to him as an inspiration to this day.
In the training room, I always say, oh, flow like water, be like water, surround the storm. You have to really flow.
It's not the outer image, it's more who it is within. And I think he took down a lot of barriers. And, you know, that guy's the icon because a lot of people look up to him.
We live Bruce Lee's philosophies constantly, and our actions are a representation of his teachings.
Because he had such a profound philosophy, that is what allows him to still be in people's minds today. We still talk about him.
In the end, he thought out of the box. He questioned it. And I think if you cease to question anything, you cease to grow.
Bruce Lee's ideas still grow in the hearts and minds of a new generation of individuals.
Kane, what does Bruce Lee mean to you?
In my mind, I think the best martial artist of our time.
The first thing that comes to mind is the pursuit of perfection.
He was so rare. There weren't a lot of people that did what he did.
Charismatic, star, action, kicking butt.
There's only one Bruce Lee in my eyes. You have the Jackie Chans and the Jet Lis and stuff, and they're all cool, and they have their own art, but no one really was Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee passed away nearly 40 years ago, never having a chance to see just how big his superstardom would become.
Dying at such a young age like that, you wonder how much did he get to really enjoy his work.
But now, Bruce Lee lives in the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time. On this episode, we honor Bruce Lee, the martial artist. Throughout his life, Bruce Lee wore many hats. Actor, director, husband, and father. But no role would come to define Bruce Lee more than that of martial artist.
The most famous martial artist is Bruce Lee, period.
Bruce Lee defines what a martial artist was.
I know some people who don't know Bruce sometimes think, oh, he's just an actor, dude. And I'm always like, no. Bruce Lee is a martial artist who took his martial arts to the big screen.
People mention Muhammad Ali or they mention Michael Jordan. When we talk about martial arts, I guarantee there's not going to be one kid that won't know the name Bruce Lee.
The fame Bruce Lee gained for being a martial artist was due to many factors, but one, undeniably, was his pure superhuman-like skills.
When the opponent expands,
I contract.
I contract.
I contract.
When he contracts,
I expand.
And when there's an opportunity,
I do not hit.
I do not hit.
I do not hit.
It hits all by itself.
Bruce Lee was a phenom. He's on the highest level of elite martial artist to ever exist.
And just as a pure martial artist, he was extraordinary.
Throughout his movies and other appearances, Bruce Lee always demonstrated awe-inspiring technique.
Bruce Lee had a great form, beautiful form, the way he moved. He has legit skills. You can tell in his footwork. The way he was bouncing on his toes and the fakes and feints, everything was just precise.
When you watched him on film, the way he fought, it was like a dance.
I love kicks. I love the beauty of the kick. And that was the thing that impressed me most about Bruce Lee. The extension that he got always inspired me, and because of that, I would sit and stretch for hours and hours and hours.
Although Bruce clearly had the moves, he also brought something else to the table: genuine, supreme athleticism.
He wasn't the biggest guy, but it's the kind of power that he had.
Not only would he deliver a punch, but the power behind that punch would just come out through his eyes, his body language, and through that punch.
And the amount of power that he was able to produce on a bag or on a sparring partner was unbelievable.
He popped me a few good ones, yes.
Everything was very direct, very fast, and obviously, you know, he was such a quick guy anyway.
I remember him as a boy, seeing some of those movies, and they are pretty incredible, and I don't think anyone's ever come close to that kind of speed.
And if you just watch him, anytime someone gets in his range, he's attacking. So he's a very aggressive fighting martial artist.
He was like a predatory cat that way, where you knew that once he pounced, it would be relentless. And that had nothing to do with being a physically imposing figure, which I always found as a great source of inspiration. You know, I'm 5'10", but I can kick one of my friends who's 6'7" in the head because of Bruce Lee. You know, I know that that's the reason.
Bruce Lee could have been a genetic phenom, but the physical heights he reached were due to good old-fashioned hard work.
Every day, I practice martial arts, you see.
He trains hard. You see the work ethic come out. You can tell that he just puts everything he's got into all of it.
Bruce Lee's philosophy was, you can never be prepared enough to compete.
Bruce Lee trained for many hours each day. And Bruce Lee didn't just practice punches and kicks.
What stood out the most was how great in shape he was. He had muscles, and he was fast and agile.
He was interested in training the whole body and really sculpting himself as a fighting machine.
The tool is your body. If your body's not in good shape, you can't do martial art. So a lot of people before, they didn't pay attention to the body, as Bruce Lee did. He's way ahead of his time period, you know.
Bruce Lee focused on all aspects of physical fitness, from strength to cardio to even diet.
Bruce Lee was the one who really started cross-training.
He started using weights. He started using protein shakes. I'm gonna run for stamina. I'm gonna eat well, because if I don't put junk food in my body, I'm actually gonna be in better shape to go kick somebody's ass.
He believed in full contact sparring and even helped popularize new types of gear.
I think it's Enter the Dragon where you fight Sammo with those gloves. I'm like, whoa, I've never seen gloves like that before. Open finger gloves where you can grab people.
It seems as though everything he did, he put his whole human force to it. He was trying to reach his maximum potential.
As a martial artist, I really admired that Bruce Lee had focused on his athleticism. Martial artists at the time, they just only were interested in the technique and not realizing that if you put strength, power, and endurance behind technique, then you have an unstoppable force. A lot of what Bruce Lee said years and years ago really holds true today.
Bruce Lee's work ethic and focus on technique and physical fitness has become a hallmark of top competitors today.
Training is important because of the fact that you have to be able to learn the skill and hone your skills and be able to use your skills and know what your body's capable of doing.
And it's not just martial artists who benefit from this theory.
So my big thing is to strengthen your core, which is very important in stunt riding because you got to move the bike sometimes with your hips and with your core.
I think that that's something that has separated me from a lot of skiers. You know, if you're strong and your cardio and everything else is good, when you perform on hill, you can do stuff that you really didn't fathom. I mean, your off training is just as important, if not more important, as it is to ski on hill.
And in football, it's the same thing. If you only do what has been done in the past, you're only going to get the results of what's been done in the past. I think you always have to keep before thinking. You always have to think a little differently to try to get better results.
Bruce Lee first began studying martial arts as a teenager in Hong Kong, learning a style of Kung Fu known as Wing Chun, which would become his foundation and help inform his personal fighting style. In Hong Kong, Bruce Lee trained under Wing Chun Sifu Yip Man, one of the most famous grandmasters of all time. Today, Yip Man's lineage has spread all over the world. Sifu Alan Lee, also a former student of Yip Man, teaches Kung Fu in Queens, New York.
Sifu Yip Man mentioned to me, Bruce Lee is a good student. He always hardworking. He is the gift for Wing Chun martial art. Like we are like Kung Fu brothers. Wing Chun is using the idea of defense and offense simultaneously. I am 63 years old, 5'5", and technically, Lauren is bigger than me, younger than me, stronger than me. Just boom! How can I find out a better way to conquer the adversary? That's how this idea starts.
When Bruce Lee moved to the United States, Chinese martial arts were relatively unknown outside of Chinese communities. Bruce Lee would become their ambassador.
What's the difference between a kung fu punch and a karate punch?
Well, a karate punch is like an iron bar, whack. A kung fu punch is like an iron chain with an iron ball attached to the end, and it go whang, and it hurt inside. One motion, and he's gone.
Upon sparring with a Muay Thai fighter, Lee gained interest in other forms of martial arts.
He had a list, and I thought it was so unique. He listed the advantages, the strength and weakness of the Korean system. He had one on the Japanese karate, and then he had Thai boxing, the strength and weaknesses of that.
He saw qualities in all these different martial arts that he could apply.
And it wasn't just martial arts. Bruce Lee saw value in all fighting styles, from fencing to boxing.
The Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee fight scene. He starts bouncing around like Muhammad Ali a little bit.
He even pulled from wrestling. It was one of the things that first attracted me to him, and I've predominantly been a wrestler my whole life, so I appreciated that.
Lee's blending of styles was revolutionary for its time.
With his martial arts, all the different styles, using from wrestling, boxing, fencing, doing the cha-cha-cha, all the rest of it, he just used everything that worked in any way to make the best working module for martial arts.
You would never have a Japanese practitioner practice the Korean system or vice versa. You would never have a grappler trained in striking arts.
Bruce Lee is one of those martial artists that was far ahead of his time.
Bruce Lee wasn't only interested in hand-to-hand combats. He also studied martial arts weaponry, something he demonstrated throughout his films. In Game of Death, Bruce Lee showcased numerous weapons in his battle against the Filipino fighter played by Dan Inosanto. Hong Kong martial artist Si Fu Fong is an expert in each of these weapons. There were the wooden dowels, which can be used as a pair or solo. There was the bamboo stick, good for a distanced attack. And of course, there were the nunchaku.
Oh, dude, the nunchucks. The nunchuck scene was the bomb.
I remember doing the nunchucks and all that because he did the nunchucks.
Bruce Lee's studying of various fighting styles eventually led him to create his own martial art philosophy, which he called Jeet Kune Do.
The art of the intercepting fist.
Jeet Kune Do is a way of intercepting fists.
In Cantonese, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. Come on, touch me, any way you can. To reach me, you must move to me. Your attack offers me an opportunity to intercept you.
In your standard style, you block. Bruce said, no blocks. I said, well, how do you stop the guy from hitting you? He said, by hitting him.
Bruce Lee taught Jeet Kune Do to a select few, including Dan Inosanto.
Bruce Lee was my instructor, but he was also my closest friend at that time period.
Over the years, Inosanto has passed on his knowledge to many others, such as Jeet Kune Do instructor Dan Anderson.
Jeet Kune Do is the concepts and principles of the late Bruce Lee. It encompasses every area in a fight: punching, kicking, trapping, grappling, and weaponry. It kind of gives you a little bit of everything as opposed to just doing one thing. Jeet Kune Do is definitely a dirty fighting system if you want to use it that way. You can kick the guy in the groin, you can kick the guy in the kneecap to try to break his knee, you could poke him in the eyeball, punch him in the throat, you could elbow his head, so there are really no rules.
Although Jeet Kune Do is taught today, Bruce never meant it to be a defined style.
The only way is no way.
This thing of using no way as the way. In other words, use all ways. In martial art, you just don't use a Chinese way or a Japanese way or a Western way. You want to use all ways to solve your problem.
Bruce Lee's whole thing was not to have one style. He didn't even want to name it Jeet Kune Do. He didn't even want to have a name for it. He didn't want to have any labeling to it at all.
Jeet Kune Do is a state of mind he's trying to get across, and not necessarily, okay, here in Jeet Kune Do, we punch like this, we kick like this.
And I never thought it was really a martial art. I always thought it to be really a philosophy more than anything else.
Over time, Bruce Lee has become the most famous name in all of martial arts.
He really revolutionized and catapulted martial arts. Who can we possibly name popular culture-wise before Bruce Lee that you can go up to somebody on the street and they would know their name?
Before Bruce Lee's rise to fame, martial arts in the United States was practiced by a select few Americans. But ever since, its popularity as a whole has exploded.
He was the guy who blew up martial arts. He was the OG, guy.
He just brought the whole martial arts thing to the forefront.
He brought it to popular culture and spread it across the world.
Bruce Lee's the founder of modern martial arts. He was the person that really kind of pushed martial arts forward into the 21st century.
Obviously, he began the Western fascination with martial arts, brought it to the masses in a way that it hadn't been exposed before. It probably started this trend of guys wanting to be able to do what he could do.
Today, it's the rare martial artist who doesn't cite Bruce Lee as an influence.
I started Taekwondo at 8 years old and immediately sought out every single Bruce Lee film I could.
The reason I got into martial arts was pretty much because of BruceLee films, nothing more in-depth than that.
From watching Bruce Lee, I became obsessed as well with martial arts.
I just wanted to do that, what he was doing.
When I was 12 years old, I went to France with my family, and I sneaked into a movie theater because Enter the Dragon from Bruce Lee was playing. I came out of that theater, and that was it. I wanted to become Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee still influences martial arts today. The multi-million-dollar business of MMA relies heavily on his principles.
In the mixed martial arts world, he's like a legend. Everyone who goes through first, second grade has to learn about George Washington. Everyone who goes through, whether it's boxing, whether it's wrestling, is gonna know about Bruce Lee.
I think I'm safe to say that every mixed martial art is probably 1 or 2 or 3 degrees away from Bruce Lee. Period.
Bruce Lee's commitment to training is used by the most successful fighters.
Now, the age of mixed martial arts, everyone's cross-training. Bruce Lee did all that back then, and people are really starting to do that now.
And Bruce Lee's mastering of many martial arts styles now takes place daily in cages around the country.
It's a shame he died so early because he was really setting up what we're doing today in the cage.
He was a mixed martial artist. He was a guy that believed in taking from whatever style you go to, whatever works for you, and using that.
Bruce Lee was able to, at a very early stage, be open to the idea of taking techniques from different styles and putting them together, and it's exactly what mixed martial arts is.
Using different forms in mixed martial arts or MMA is crucial these days.
Putting everything together to be the perfectional mixed martial artist.
For mixed martial arts is exactly what we're doing now, where we're cutting off all the dead weight, all the stuff that doesn't work, and just sticking with the basic stuff, and he really was kind of revolutionary in that way.
Bruce planted the seeds that were the philosophy that became what MMA is today. Unfortunately, he was long gone before it ever really became a reality in an actual competition.
He definitely was a trailblazer. I mean, it's clear.
There is one difference, however, between the sport of mixed martial arts and Bruce Lee's fighting style: rules.
There's a lot of different things between the sport aspect of it, which is very close to the reality, but you still can't really go to the eye. And you can't go to the C1 and C2, 3 strike behind the neck. People will be paralyzed, see? Right? You still can't go to the groin, but it's close to the reality. It's pretty good sport.
Be it in a cage or on the street, knowing how to fight was only part of what it meant to be a martial artist to Lee.
Bruce Lee didn't live martial arts. He was martial arts. So when he woke up in the morning, martial arts was on his mind through the day and even when he went to bed and slept.
Because martial arts is a lifestyle, it's a way of living.
Come on, remember Miyagi? Karate here. It's in your heart.
It's not something you just put on when you're at the gym and then you go home and do whatever it is that you do then. That mentality and that approach that you developed in martial arts is going to apply there in just about every piece of your life.
A martial artist is trying to better his life through the use of martial arts skill.
It's a mind, body, and spirit alliance, and that to me is what he was about.
In the end, Bruce Lee's ultimate goal was to evolve all aspects of martial arts, and for that, he will forever be its greatest icon.
What makes me learn martial art is totally because of Bruce Lee, because he's my biggest idol. And then I hope one day I'll be like Bruce Lee.
That was the unique gift that Bruce Lee had. He really made you want to be him. He made you want to practice martial arts. He made you want to be better, I guess, than you were.
He lives in the art, and he lives in the idea. He is the man.
Interview, take one.
Would you describe yourself as a Bruce Lee superfan?
I am absolutely a Bruce Lee superfan.
He was like the epitome of coolness.
The shades and the hair and the clothes. Such a badass.
You can't think of Kung Fu films without mentioning his name.
It was the first time that we had seen these awesome moves.
I mean, he could use nunchucks and knock a fly off a wall with them from 6 feet away.
He wanted to emulate Bruce Lee.
You can see little kids running around with Bruce Lee t-shirts and imitating him still to this day.
I mean, there's like so many different people trying to do what he did.
It just dawns on me every time I hear something go, "Wah!" I mean, what a cultural icon he is.
Bruce Lee. He was one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. And the cultural phenomenon that surrounds him continues to rage.
He left an indelible cultural imprint behind, in every single way, not only in his chosen field, but just in pop culture.
Now, Bruce Lee lives in the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time. On this episode, we take on Bruce Lee, the Trendsetter. Bruce Lee first achieved stardom nearly 4 decades ago. Today, he remains a powerful cultural figure. His imprint can be found throughout pop culture.
Everyone has seen a Bruce Lee movie.
I used to love them all when I was a kid. My brother and I, we used to just watch them and then beat the hell out of each other.
There is simply no denying Bruce Lee's mass appeal. But how did one man come to own his icon status? He had the it factor.
He was smooth. He was handsome. He was a star. He had presence. He had grace about him. Something that you couldn't teach. This was who he really was.
He had a certain something, a mojo, a quality that just, it's timeless.
Bruce Lee was a standout in any crowd. And his natural charisma caught the attention of some very important eyes following a karate tournament in 1964.
He caught the eye of a producer who had said, yeah, you know what, this is really amazing. You've got this incredible physical presence and you're obviously an amazing fighter.
Bruce had the speed, the power, and the precision that made him shine in competition. But that wasn't all. He radiated charisma, and he knew how and when to turn on the charm.
As much as he was like the fighter and the martial arts, but he also had a certain kind of charm to him. You know what I mean?
He knew he had it, and he did use it. Yes, of course.
And that's exactly what he did.
My last name is Lee, Bruce Lee.
During a screen test for the Green Hornet, he laid on the charm.
Or, if I can back up a little bit, they start back from here, and then come back. All right. It's kind of worried.
The Bruce Lee charisma landed a knockout.
There's something really amazing that Bruce exudes when he was on screen.
You can YouTube his screen tests for the studios, and you see in those screen tests, right, that not only is he an expert kung fu dude, he is a movie star.
As Bruce Lee's popularity grew, it wasn't just personality and charm that got him noticed. He had real physical allure and a slick sense of style that was totally original.
He had fashion sense.
Bruce Lee's style is timeless.
He's like almost like a pimp, dude. He'd like seriously look good, like all the time. Like just flashy dresser, always had the big Hollywood shades on.
He wore like dope glasses. He had a cool haircut.
No one would dispute the fact that he was a good-looking guy. The ladies loved when he took off his shirt. It's interesting because he probably weighed a $130 wet, but he was ripped.
He was tight looking. Bad to bone, dude.
Bruce Lee fashioned just the right look, but he didn't just wear his cool, he spoke it too.
You got to listen. Listen.
There was a way he talked. There was a way he talked. Everything was pronounced. You know what I mean?
If you try to remember, you will lose.
He knew how he wanted to be perceived. He knew what he believed in, and he knew what everybody should know about him. His swag was just so articulate. You know what I mean?
That free your mind quote. You must free your mind.
Like water.
Be like water. Water goes into a cup. It becomes the cup. It's such a simple philosophical idea, you know what I mean? But the way he says it, be like water, my friend. My friends. I mean, that's so nice. You call me your friend.
Bruce Lee's distinctive way of speaking was part of his unique package, just like his sharp sense of humor.
You could tell his personality could be someone who's a jokester.
He was a comedian. That's the one thing that people don't know about him. He was hysterical.
The way he would answer his questions were just direct, looking at you in the eyes, just very confident. Maybe would have a little smirk or smile if he thought something was funny.
Wow. One time, my dad was engaged in this very philosophical conversation with my godfather.
I could confide with him in any subject that I wanted. I considered him, at that time period, my closest friend.
And my godfather says, Dan, I want you to take this coin and I want you to balance it very carefully, you know, from your head all the way down your nose, all the way to your chin. And so my father, of course, you know, does it. And then all of a sudden, my godfather just breaks out into this huge laughter and he goes, look in the mirror, look in the mirror. And then there's my father with a big dark line down his face. So, you know, that's the side that, you know, I knew of Bruce Lee. He was a great, you know, comedian in his personal life.
And I think that's the beautiful thing about the man.
Bruce Lee had indisputable poise, wit, and charm. But he didn't just radiate cool during his lifetime. His off-the-charts charisma would ignite public fascination for decades, cementing his iconic status long after his sudden and tragic death shocked fans around the world. For a star with such universal allure, Bruce Lee spent a surprisingly short time making movies.
When you look at Bruce Lee's film career, it's really short. I mean, that's just insane, you know? But they were really powerful, genre-changing films.
He completed only 4 major films before his acting career came to a tragic halt. On July 20th, 1973, Bruce Lee died at age 32. Ironically, he would not live to see the opening of the one film that would catapult him to international fame.
Enter the Dragon.
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 My favorite Bruce Lee movie was Enter the Dragon.
The year was 1973, and Bruce Lee mania was about to take hold.
When Enter the Dragon was first released to the world, it really was phenomenal. It was like the equivalent of Star Wars. It really was.
One of the producers invited me to the premiere of Enter the Dragon. It was at the Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, naturally. And I went to see it, and I didn't even know what I was going to see. And I had not really heard about Bruce Lee.
The movie is illuminated in every frame by the presence of Bruce Lee. But what's amazing about Enter the Dragon is how well written it is, how well structured it is, how beautifully it's shot.
It made people realize in Hollywood, wow, here's a genre we've ignored. I think Hollywood had a real wake-up call that, you know, there's something here. Meanwhile, the world got to see a star and to see this amazing man on the screen capture everybody's hearts and imagination.
When I saw Enter the Dragon, I was watching a fresh hero. I was watching a hero I'd never seen before.
Enter the Dragon was a massive hit, grossing over $90 million worldwide. Bruce Lee the Man was gone, but demand for Bruce Lee the movie star began to skyrocket.
Because of Enter the Dragon's success, everybody wanted more Bruce Lee films.
Bruce Lee actually had been working on another film before he died, Game of Death. But production had been halted on the project so that Enter the Dragon could be completed first. Only 100 minutes of footage had been shot at the time of Lee's death, and the film had to be finished without him.
When I found out that he actually died in the process of making Game of Death, it became that much more special to me to watch the whole process.
And it was hard to think how to finish it without Bruce Lee.
When Game of Death resumed production in 1978, it relied on some fairly comical tricks to make up for its missing star. Rudimentary fighting techniques and body doubles weren't an ideal fix.
Patience, that's not one of our virtues.
But they did signal a new trend, finding ways to cash in on the Bruce Lee name.
Everybody that had ever shook Bruce's hand that was in the martial arts put his picture up on the wall. Good business.
Suddenly, everybody wanted to make martial arts films. Everybody wanted to be the hotshot martial arts guy who just looks like $1 million while he's kicking the crap out of somebody.
Everyone wanted to capitalize on the Bruce Lee money train. His movies gained a new audience as box sets of his classic films are released.
Let's see what you're made of.
Okay.
Ha!
And Kung Fu theater becomes a popular weekend program on television. The art of imitation also took hold, as Bruce Lee clones and spoofs on his original films became prevalent.
There's a movie called The Last Dragon, which is almost like a spoof. Bruce Leroy, great movie. There was an old comedy called They Still Call Me Bruce.
This is when the great era of Bruceploitation comes in which you basically took a bunch of guys, some of which, could throw a punch or a kick semi-well, some of which just looked Asian. The producers didn't care. And you gave them a name that sort of sounded like Bruce Lee. But he wasn't exactly Bruce Lee. The most well-used Bruce Lee impersonator was a guy named Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, no one's gonna tell the difference, right?
But the Bruce Lee difference still holds a dominant place in cinematic culture.
Still today, his name is synonymous with, Kung Fu.
Bruce Lee set a whole new standard for Kung Fu heroes. Killer athletic ability, plus acting chops to boot.
Chuck Norris.
Chuck Norris is a good martial artist.
You had the Jackie Chans and the Jet Lis.
There's great guys, Jackie Chan, Jet Li.
Would there be a Jackie Chan with no Bruce Lee?
In fact, the matter is, we wouldn't know who Jackie Chan was, or who Jet Li was, or who a lot of these martial artists that have become huge in the last, 20, 30 years. It all boils down to the fact that we still want Bruce Lee.
Guys who have come after him, they've never been able to capture that look and that feel and that expertise.
But it's not only martial arts stars that should bow to the master. Bruce Lee set the bar for modern-day action heroes across the board.
There would be no Stallone and no Rocky and no Arnold and no Jason Statham, none of the sons of Bruce Lee without this guy pointing the way. Stallone can box. Those muscles are real. Jason Statham can fight. That's not fake.
And you can see it now with all these guys that still have that kind of swagger about them, that sort of I'm a fighter kind of swagger about them. That dates back to Bruce Lee.
When we were doing Charlie's Angels, he was a huge influence for us.
Still to this day in the Bourne movies, we use the school that he started. We use their choreography.
From Charlie's Angels to the Bourne Identity, the mark of Bruce Lee's brilliance remains a powerful force to be reckoned with.
It's beyond legend status, you could say. Legends accomplish things, but he set the standard for things.
If imitation is the highest form of flattery, Bruce Lee's been held in very high esteem, as look-alike actors and cheap kung fu film knockoffs were standard fare. But public fascination would eventually shift as the interest in copying Bruce Lee waned. The drive to honor him gained momentum,
And I'm in this little tiny village, remote village in Italy, and there's postcards of my godfather. And I'm thinking, this is just amazing. Then I'm in Mexico in some other remote village, and there's a poster of him.
Evidence of Lee's influence can be found throughout the pop culture landscape as well, especially in modern movies.
When you watch Kill Bill, who do you think about? Bruce Lee.
Kill Bill, which is this huge Valentine that Quentin Tarantino does to Asian cinema in general.
With Quentin Tarantino and Kill Bill, you know, there's definitely an homage to Bruce Lee.
It's homogenized in the culture. We all know Game of Death. Like, we all know the yellow tracksuit.
Still see the yellow tracksuits today.
The Bruce Lee imprint made a mark on the Matrix films as well, in a scene directly influenced by Way of the Dragon.
This is the way he moved those hands.
The Bruce Lee aesthetic was really what was in force.
And you actually see Keanu Reeves trying to fight Kung Fu and like trying to move as fast as he can. And that's Bruce Lee.
Everything about him is just bleeding Bruce Lee.
Reinventing classic scenes from Bruce Lee movies is a habit in Hollywood, as are attempts to replay his signature moves, like thumbing his nose and releasing a rebel yell to cue a fight. But certain Bruce Lee trademarks exist on a much larger scale: mass merchandising.
I had Bruce Lee action figures, magazines, t-shirts.
I don't know anybody who didn't have a Bruce Lee poster back in the day.
And I know there was at one point a line of martial arts products that had his name or his likeness on them, like sparring pads that I had that were Bruce Lee.
Even leaders in music and sports have shown their adoration. But nothing signifies Bruce Lee quite like his weapon of choice.
Oh, dude, the nunchucks.
When you think about nunchucks, who do you think about?
I think every boy my generation had a pair of nunchucks.
Dude, when I saw Bruce Lee with nunchucks, the whole deal, I ordered a ninja suit, I ordered nunchucks, Chinese stars, I had all the stuff. Like I asked my mom, Mom, it's a nunchuck.
All the kids in our neighborhood all the boys wanted to be Bruce Lee, all of them.
His legacy still looms large on screen, and fans around the world continue to emulate Bruce Lee. But he lives on virtually as well, in video and computer games that graphically showcase his fighting style. Popular series such as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Soul Calibur, and Tekken all have characters based on Bruce Lee. At Blizzard Entertainment, one of the world's leading video design companies, Jay Wilson finds Bruce Lee an inspiration for his creations.
I love Hong Kong action films. So much of that kind of was, for me, the door was opened, and so many of those things inspired me throughout my career.
When it came time to design something new, Wilson knew just where to turn.
When we were working on Diablo 3 and we had choices of different characters to make, the one that I kind of championed the strongest was the monk. And the reason was that I really loved the idea of doing a martial arts character, especially in a fantasy game. That the idea of basically taking forward the philosophy of Bruce Lee, all that inspiration.
And while video games put the Bruce Lee legacy in motion, comic books revere the master in print. Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Axel Alonso has been responsible for reinventing comic book characters like the X-Men and Spider-Man. But his fascination with the genre stems from Kung Fu.
One of my favorite comics was Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, which was, of course, inspired by the Kung Fu action era, which was, of course, inspired by Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was instrumental in the formation of Kung Fu comics.
Shang-Chi was a 1970s Kung Fu comic by Marvel. Its main character, patterned after Bruce Lee, gave the comic book hero a whole new twist.
Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, unlike Spider-Man or the Hulk, this guy had no superpowers. He just was one hell of a fighter. Like Bruce Lee, Shang-Chi was all about inner calm and peace. He was not inherently violent at all. He used violence only in defense and as a means to an end.
The key to immortality.
The key to immortality
is first
living a life.
Living a life worth remembering.
For nearly 40 years, Bruce Lee has remained the ultimate pop icon. But of the many ways we've paid tribute, from action figures to comic book heroes, video games to vintage t-shirts, one honor ranks the highest. That of hero.
He was a massive hero to me.
A real man, a real hero. He was a superhero in my mind.
When you're a little kid, especially being a small kid, like you always look up to these like heroes that like can make you feel like you can have that strength or whatever. And Bruce was that guy for me.
Bruce Lee's, he's an icon.
He owns it and will. I can't imagine there being another star that comes along that encapsulates the beauty, the power, the iconography of Bruce Lee.
He will be the Bruce Lee forever.
He is the man.
So why was Bruce so important?
When you look up the word inspiration in the dictionary, it should be Bruce Lee's picture. Because to me, I feel like he's just the ultimate inspirer, the ultimate motivator, you know what I mean?
Bruce Lee influenced so many people in so many different walks of life.
It's almost like superhero stuff where it's made up, but this is real.
Some of the things that Bruce Lee has said resonates forever.
Be water, my friend, my friend.
Now, Bruce Lee lives. In the series that celebrates the life and legacy of the greatest martial artist of all time. On this episode, we take on the Master. To be revered and sought out signifies a certain level of respect and admiration for who you are and what you've contributed. Bruce Lee's teachings, acting, and fighting have had people seeking his wisdom for decades.
How about teaching me that?
But how did Bruce Lee gain such lofty status? What path did he follow to become a master to so many? In the early 60s, Bruce Lee's life was a whirlwind of activity. There was college, a marriage, the birth of his first child, and instructing martial arts. Around this time, Lee started to create something in the way of a message. He knew he had something important to offer the world and wanted to share it with a larger audience. So Lee went knocking on Hollywood's door.
Test X2, take 2.
An early screen test shot in 1965 shows the young Bruce Lee, unintimidated, confidence beaming.
What is the most powerful of the best forms of Oriental fighting?
Well, it's bad to say the best, but in my opinion, I think Kung Fu is pretty good.
It was that self-assurance that caught so many people's eyes and had them start to notice this young man with a plan.
His presence was just gnarly, and he just was confident at a young age even. Like, this whole way he carried himself was just, he just spewed confidence, you know what I mean? It was just cool.
But that confidence wasn't just cool. It was a part of his very essence, a foundation which Lee would be able to build on and use to communicate his message.
I mean, he immortalized confidence. You could see it in his eyes, you could see it in his body movements. Everything about him asserts that.
He was smart, he was super talented, but he was so present. He was super focused on what he wanted, and he got it. He was like, bring what you are and who you are to the table, and it can and probably will work.
By 1967, Bruce Lee had already achieved some fame in the United States with his co-starring role in The Green Hornet. But the show only lasted one season and was canceled. But that didn't deter Bruce. As with any great fighter, he got up and kept on fighting. It is a valuable lesson that still inspires.
I always felt like it's your personality and your character that really makes you who you are. And it's not, you know, your outer shell. It's been about like the fight inside you. And for me growing up, being a shorter, you know, basically shorter guy in the class always. And I remember I played basketball and I was like the shortest dude on the team. It always made me try harder though. Like I always wanted to compete and be the best.
Bruce was that guy for me because like he was a small dude as well, but he had the charisma of a 7-footer. You know, like he had so much charisma that he couldn't fit in that little body.
He wanted to achieve and attacked it with vigor and passion. And I think everybody should approach your life that way.
It's been said that to be a master means you have achieved a point of perfection, an ideal. But Lee had a lesson for all the other masters out there. There was no such thing as perfection. There was always more to learn.
Bruce Lee was all about connecting with all the different things that he was, you know, the fighter, the philosopher, the cultural icon, the family man, the teacher.
Bruce Lee at that time was so way ahead of the game, you know, as a martial artist, as a human being. I often thought to myself, my gosh, we're following a child. I really didn't mind studying with a person that was much younger because though he was younger, he was so highly evolved and so mature for his age level.
There's two types of martial artists. I think there's the doer, the person that can execute martial arts skill, but also the teacher. And those are two separate skills. Bruce Lee had both.
Today, all over the world, Bruce's Jeet Kune Do is still taught. And as Lee would have wanted, it is constantly evolving.
You know, kind of feel it. Everything is feel. Very nice.
Dan Anderson, who studied under Bruce Lee's good friend Dan Inosanto, has been teaching Jeet Kune Do for 17 years.
Try to tighten up the transition a little bit better. Very nice.
He has taught Hollywood stars, including Mila Jovovich.
Bruce Lee, he used the philosophy and the understanding to let things go and to continuously improve and refine. I think growing as a martial artist is the most important principle. I try to learn every day from my students. I learn from the mistakes they make. I learn from what they pick up easy. I think that you should always constantly be growing and learning in your art. The mentoring behind what he did and the research behind what he did was way ahead of its time. Beautiful.
Between his martial arts and his movies, Bruce Lee seemed an unstoppable force. Bruce Lee was a fountain of knowledge about martial arts and life. But he didn't lecture or preach to get his message across. He did it through old-fashioned storytelling within his films.
I love the concept of Game of Death.
Game of Death was one of my favorite films.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was in it. Are you kidding me right now? Like, yellow sweatsuit? Like, that's awesome. Like, I don't care. I still love that movie, and I will fight you to the death over it.
Bruce Lee called upon his good friend Dan Inosanto to help on the movie.
So I get this phone call, and he says he wanted me to come to Hong Kong to help him film this picture called The Game of Death. And he tells me the storyline.
The key scene has Bruce Lee battling up the stairs of a pagoda. It was a metaphor for his teachings. The only way he would be able to move up the structure would be to fight a different opponent who possessed a different martial arts style. Lee would have to adapt and evolve with each fight. Key tenets of his beliefs.
He used each level to kind of symbolize the conquering of a master.
One of Lee's first encounters would be against Dan Inosanto's Filipino style of martial arts. Having won, Bruce Lee continues upward. He must now change, advance, against a Korean martial art called Hapkido. Finally, he meets what appears to be an insurmountable challenge. Not only is his opponent, played by the NBA star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, almost double his size, but he also fights in the same Jeet Kune Do style as Bruce Lee.
The person at the end was supposed to represent the person with no style, the person who's all like water, the person who could flow and kind of do it all. It's really symbolic to show that at the top of the pagoda, you're not bound by anything. I think that's an approach for learning martial arts.
In the pagoda, each level was a different way of fighting. Don't put yourself in one way of fighting because you're restricting yourself against someone else that might have a different technique. I took that back into bike riding. Keep your mind wide open and be able to diversify your riding skills.
What Bruce was able to do was allow his philosophy to come through naturally. It wasn't forced on you. It was there for you to take, if you wanted it. Using your knowledge to help others was something Bruce was all about. Teaching and mentoring is something many of today's cultural icons also embrace.
I'm an older guy in the sport. I mean, I'm still kind of young, but
Grandma and Grandpa.
Yeah, I've been around for 10 years, you know. So anytime a new kid comes up, and I try to bring them under my wing a little bit and let them know where I might have fallen short. And at the same time, I'm going to tell them everything that, I want this sport to be.
I feel like I'm constantly trying to teach the guys under me. Let's have you both go together. Give them my experiences to try to fast track them to where I'm at.
And he was always about inspiring people and helping people, Like, you see, he wanted to teach everybody. He felt like it was an open book.
I'm so inspired when I change someone's thought process or their behavior to just be a better person or be a better martial artist. It's the most rewarding feeling in the world. Beautiful.
He didn't say, I'm gonna teach Jeet Kune Do and that's all you're gonna learn. That's it. He was like, I'll teach you Jeet Kune Do and then as a friend, what can you give back to me?
Let me remind you, Jeet Kune Do is just a name used, a boat to get one across. And once across, it is to be discarded and not to be carried on one's back.
In 1940, under the Year of the Dragon, Bruce Lee was born. And for nearly 33 years, he battled, strived, and thrived. But in 1973, the dragon was gone. For someone so strong, so full of life, Lee's death, caused by a cerebral edema, was a shock.
One of the producers of Enter the Dragon invited me to the premiere. I was immediately sucked in by Bruce Lee and by what he could do and his presence and the charisma of the guy. I saw Fred in the lobby after the movie, and I went up to him and I hugged him, and oh man, that Bruce Lee, what a future he has. And Fred said, he doesn't have any future, he died. I was like so stunned because he was so alive to me.
When I heard about Bruce Lee died, I don't want to believe it. Totally astonished, and it's a big loss.
The first time I ever saw my father cry was when my godfather passed away. I still remember it like it was yesterday. And it took a while for my dad to even believe that, he had died.
I think I cried easily, off and on, for about 48 hours. Because I was very, very close to him. And for me, that's a very emotional time in my life. I cried as much for him as when my parents passed away.
Bruce Lee, I think, in some ways, knew he was only going to be in this world for a little while because it seemed like he was in a race to tell everybody and anybody about martial arts, about his philosophy.
It's a testament to him as a human being that, almost 40 years after his death, people are still fascinated by him.
Philip Eng, a rising star in Asian martial arts films, is one of those who is still drawn to Bruce Lee. He finds traces from the icon's life as he makes his way through Hong Kong.
This part of Hong Kong, it's one of the only parts of Hong Kong that's still the same as when Bruce Lee was around. So to get a sense of Bruce Lee, it's really nice to walk around these streets and see how he used to live. It always amazes me that wherever we go in Hong Kong, we can still find pictures of Bruce Lee everywhere. I remember this scene. I tried to emulate this kick, but I ended up falling. Awesome. I think this place still exists in Macau. It's like a film in my hand of him doing nunchucks. And look at some of these newspapers from, 1973? The Way of the Dragon is the name that I prefer to call it. 30 Hong Kong dollars. I might make a purchase a little bit later. In 1973, scenes from the Bruce Lee epic, Enter the Dragon, were shot at this location, including some of the most famous kung fu fights in movie history. You know, it's really amazing being here, you know. Coming to Hong Kong, making kung fu movies, now obviously it's all because of Bruce Lee, you know. And being at a location where he shot Enter the Dragon, it's amazing. Bruce Lee's gone, but he lives in our hearts.
Bruce Lee's death was nothing short of tragic, but death is no match for immortality. Up next, Bruce Lee continues to inspire and push us to greatness.
For me, Bruce is just, throughout my whole life, he just showed me how to dream big.
Into the It's Bruce Lee, the master. Bruce Lee's death was a shock. But in a short moment in time, he was able to build an inspiring legacy. He conquered TV and movies and set forth a new approach to martial arts. And although we are left spellbound by his visual presence, his most lasting impression comes from his heart and mind, his philosophy.
Many people didn't realize the amazing philosopher that he was. They saw him more as an action figure. He was indeed a philosopher.
His philosophies cover everything. Everything that we have to deal with in life and struggle, we can use his philosophy to overcome.
The philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, it kind of helps you express yourself. It kind of helps you formulate ideas better. You know, there's a secondary benefit than just learning how to defend yourself. There's a whole idea behind improving yourself.
It wasn't just about martial arts, it was about life. He was a teacher of life. You know, how to live your life in a way where the ends are limitless.
To achieve unlimited potential, Bruce Lee taught something he called honest self-expression. In other words, being true to yourself. Of all the thoughts and ideals Lee created, this was the one that Lee thought needed to be mastered to achieve greatness.
When Bruce Lee talked about express yourself, that's what I want out of my students. I'm gonna teach you a few moves, but you make it yours. And I'm there to coach them along, not to tell them exactly what to do, but try to help them find what Bruce Lee found.
I totally agree with Bruce Lee's assessment of martial arts because there's no lying inside the cage. There's no lying during a fight. Whoever you are truly comes out.
Honestly expressing yourself is, to me, being honest with yourself and finding a way to communicate that through different barriers, whether they be language, cultural, moral, whatever the case may be.
Everything you ever aspire for or hope for, it's already within you. You just have to finally realize that. You don't have to look outside of you for some fake persona, for some this or that. It's inside of you already.
That's me on my dirt bike. Me being on the Ride Freestyle Motocross is an honest way to express me and my personality and who I am, my style on my dirt bike the way I want to do it.
Honest self-expression is genuinely doing what it is that you want to do that's going to fulfill you. We're in a sport where you got to push the limits, but you should push it in the way that you feel like doing it, not in the way that the industry thinks you should be or the judges or whomever.
Honest self-expression to me is about totally expressing yourself and trying to be as original as possible.
Bruce Lee mindset was all about that, letting that honest expression come out of you and to not be so confined in your thought process.
Whatever your art is, you have to turn that into a language, and that language is an expression.
When someone dies, you often reflect on the legacy they left behind. But Bruce Lee didn't leave anything behind. He pushed it forward. Nearly 40 years after his death, Bruce Lee still inspires us. But it is not just martial artists who are motivated by him. Actors, dancers, skateboarders, freestyle motocross riders, all of them have in some way been influenced by Bruce Lee, the master.
He just showed me how to dream big and go for it. Whether you reach the goal or not is not the important part. It's the effort and the process you're putting in to get there. It's enjoying the journey of it.
No one's had the impact that Bruce Lee's had.
Bruce Lee's left, I think, a lot more than he probably would ever know behind.
Bruce Lee once said, in order to be immortalized, you got to live your life in a way that would be remembered. And he certainly did that way beyond.
Bruce Lee has touched millions and millions of people. The philosophy just keeps coming.
He inspired me in every way.
It's almost like superhero stuff where it's made up, but this is real. He really helped me become who I am today.
I mean, kids that are born in 2002, 2003, who are 8 or 9 years old now, know who Bruce Lee is. He's just one of those guys, like the Beatles, that kind of just lives on.
When you see Bruce on screen, he is so vital, so alive, so intensely present in every frame of those films that you have to think of him as immortal.
Bruce Lee is an immortal, and the world is much better because of his spirit and his contribution.
You have different groups that don't get along with each other, but somehow he unites that. He lives in spirit, and he lives in the idea, and the idea is the strongest thing.
It is the spirit and ideas of Bruce Lee that will always inspire us, to make us question the norm, to push the limits, and ultimately have us be the best we can be. His way has become ours to strive for, and so it is through us that Bruce Lee lives.